Oh, we're live now.
Perfect. Well, let's get the slides deck up and share it there. There we go. There you go. That should be good.
All right. Let's get started. Welcome to our presentation today. I'm Eva Weens. I manage a security solutions architecture team for CDW Canada, based out of here, Winnipeg, where I'm assuming most of the folks on this call are connecting from. But there could be people from all over Western Canada and all over Canada. So. I've been with this company for 5 years. We started back on the Scalar days here, and same with my my co-presenter here today and my boss Theo Van Wyk. I've been in cybersecurity. Some of you might recognize me. I've been around this industry for a long time. And I'm very happy to be with CDW now. We've got a great practice, and I'll go into more detail. But Theo, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Theo Van Wyk. I'm head of cybersecurity and solutions development, which is really just a mouthful for saying I get to lead the security practice with great people like Evo here at CDW. We're just extremely excited to be here presenting to you today. It's been, I think from my perspective, Evo and I was talking just before we jumped on here, and we did a quick tally of our history in security and IT. I think it scared us both a little bit when we saw the numbers. But so I've been around 20 years that I've been in one way or form involved in cybersecurity. So it's a real passion. It's a background for me, and I'm super excited to be here to talk to you today. So let's advance the slide there. There we go. Evo, will you tell us a bit more about CDW Canada, please?
Sure, absolutely. CDW Canada comprised, of 900 plus co-workers, 9 offices across the country. I get to lead the security solutions architecture team, which is located in at least one architect in each of these locations. Really the growth of overall CDW Canada, the new CDW Canada, is comprised of what we talk about from the Scalar team, bringing together the CDW team, and really bolstering that information security, and having $1.2 billion of revenue. And I'll talk in the next slide, Theo, if you can advance it a little more, on how we use that strength to help with our security practice. So we like to break our security practice into 3 columns: prepare, defend, and respond. Prepare being what we do from a risk advisory perspective, where we're talking about assessing risk, aligning to global standards, implementing controls, and identifying what controls need to be implemented from a risk advisory side. So that's where we talk about the penetration testing that we can do, really the vendor agnostic side of the house, threat and risk assessments, and also any audit support that's necessary. So that's our prepare column, which transfers over to where we start looking at more specific product-based approach on the defend column, where we can start saying, now that you identify these gaps in your environment from a vendor agnostic perspective, you still need to solve these problems. And that's where vendors really can help. And that's where we can help you design solutions or look at your existing solutions that you have within your environment and make sure that they help. Right? So that's where we can bring our product team to identify what technology is needed, but also a professional services team to help you implement that technology in a very, using vendor best practices. So deploying the most effective technologies is part of how we help. And that's where that big CDW $1.2 billion muscle can really help. And then moving on to that, once you've implemented that, we can also help you on a day-to-day management of this. The operational day-to-day managed security service can be provided. Advanced analytics, bringing business context, and having that continuous validation of the technology within your environment. So, in a nutshell, this is what we do from a CDW security perspective: implementing, preparing you for for what you need to do, defending, and helping you implement the right controls, and carrying on from an operational perspective from there on. So,
I want to add in one thing quickly
sure.
there, Ivo, and for those of you with a keen eye, you'll notice this methodology follows most of the common frameworks out there for security. So really, we've based it off of a NIST to reflect NIST, but also you can map ISO in here, right? And it's just a thought process involved that we'd like to see and that we'd like to apply to any security opportunity, which is that ability to think up front, understand the relevance, put it in the right context, and then deploy it accordingly as needed. The other one thing that we like to highlight here, it's not so much a theme this year of the study, but we've pulled the theme through the last few years, is resilience versus security, right? And the big thing here for us is if you get too focused on just security and you focus on that defend tier with the controls, you leave yourself in a spot where if you get compromised, and we'll see some of the stats in a moment, it's really difficult to come back if you sort of put your whole bet on not getting compromised. But we really try to talk here and our customers about in that prepare phase, think about your IR phases, think about the response part all the way through to response so that you have a resilient ability that if something happens, you can contain and control it. And we'll dig more into some of these in a moment.
And this is, Theo and I were talking about, this is the 7th year in a row that we've done this report, the 2nd year under the CDW banner. We've had, lots of views into what the Canadian market, and the whole idea behind this was to create a security report that gave the right Canadian context, right? So every year, and I think I've presented at WCISC maybe 3 times on this report, so I'm quite used to presenting on the report. But and every year it's great to give this introduction and say we need to have a Canadian view. Well, what Theo and I did this time, and mostly Theo, crunched through the data and was able to really give us a Western Canada perspective, because I think typically it's a tale of two cities between us and the, for example, the large Toronto market or the large bank market, and how we compare as Western Canada. So we've done a little bit of breaking down of that data and separating the Canadian market, the Western market from the rest of the country. And Theo, I know you broke down some of the data. I don't know if you want to go through the exact percentage of each one and kind of, what you found out of the overall respondents, how many were from this part of the country.
Absolutely. We don't have to dig too deep into it. I think the big thing is when Ivo and I work and we spend many days crunching numbers and going through data sets, after IDC conducts the study for us and bring us the results, one of the things that we always try to do is do some form of sanity checking in terms of the ratios and the data and how it relates. And what we did this year is we were trying to find if there's very specific Western Canada or Canadian deviations from the results. We had 1 or 2 tables that we highlighted. The majority of it actually aligned much closer. Not that we realized it would be close, but it was good to see the alignment nationally. And we did, one of the sanity checks here was to see the ratios and just how it affected the overall data. So out of our 557 respondents, 150 was Western Canadian based respondents, so around 30%, which is actually a decent sample size for when we look at the national distribution of how the rest of the respondents panned out. And then the other important item here was that the small, medium, and large and enterprise ratios were aligned with the larger study as well. And so breaking that out, you saw like it was, even when I was actually surprised, it was almost like a spot on, with the exception of the enterprise having a slightly bigger shift in national, and that's just contributed to like GTA, Toronto, some of the head office distribution of organizations. But other than that, we actually had a really, really good representative sample across the board, which is fantastic. This means when we're talking about the national numbers in the tables, and we double check that, it actually then makes sense why it aligned very closely to what we've seen. So
yeah, go ahead. Do
you want to, I'll jump in on this one. This one, it really excites me, right? What we've seen here is, keep in mind, the results for this study was taken sort of right in the middle of COVID last year. So the study was conducted November of 2020 was when we sent out the questionnaires, and was concluded by December 2020. So we really had sort of the first time a view, and we were very concerned with what this was going to do to our numbers, our stats, our trends. And the reality is, as we dig through, and you'll see in a moment, what it really did was that we found that innovation was driving new approaches and tools. And we saw what really happened was how people were tackling technologies to solve for brand new business problems. And, although there was some new tool sets and technologies, the reality is the biggest change we saw was in how people and how organizations tackle to implement it. Ivo and I have had a lot of discussions with customers around, remote working is not a foreign concept, but the volume and the scale to which organizations rolled it out, that was really different. And so when you keep this in mind, and that some of these security trends were well established beforehand, but just had a different magnitude and scale and way of being applied, we definitely saw some accelerations in the numbers over here that we'll chat about as well. Ivo, anything else on this one with the innovation for you?
No, I think it's and we've been talking about this since the work from home started with COVID. It's that whole digital transformation being pushed in organizations much faster than they expected. Right? They had the plans, they had everything in place, but they were moving very slowly, and that accelerated it. And I think cybersecurity, as a side effect, came along with it. I don't know if it came along at the same speed, right? And I think we're not just spoil the future findings here, but there is a little bit of a disconnect there, but it definitely was accelerated with it, and that was one of the findings that we noticed out of this study.
Perfect. So do you want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing around this, especially maybe Western Canada specific, Ivo?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as we talk about the growing digital transformation that organizations went through within the last year, and what the difference was from before. I think that there is a real practical application of zero trust, and we're going to double click that a bit more, and a more of our understanding of zero trust. Orchestration is, it's become a buzzword. It's become very common. Every vendor has some form of is starting to have some form of automation or some kind of SOAR technology. API integration used to be something that only developers would touch on, but now it's commonplace sort of conversation in every security operations center, and there's been and I think AI ML is following behind it. Not falling behind, but close behind that conversation of automation. How are we going to start using AI and ML for day-to-day security operations, and how are we going to improve that? So that's been all accelerated to a certain extent, and it is tying into security. But I think very related to what you talked in the previous slide, which is we had to adapt. Right? We had to adapt to working from home. We had to adapt to having our security, not being able to grow our security operations in the same way that we were in previous years, which was already pretty slow. So that was an interesting finding here. And I don't know if there's anything more you add to that.
No, I think, one of the interesting things for me with the topics that you'll see here is when we think about zero trust, when we think about orchestration and automation, it sort of became those overarching topics that encompassed a lot of the new buzzwords that we saw. So when you think about things like SASE, so secure access services edge, we saw a huge explosion of that. And it was sort of wrapped with the concept of zero trust. And we'll, like Ivo said, we're going to dig into each one of these a little bit differently and with more detail in a moment. But I think the real important thing for me here was that, don't fixate on these as the only items. These were sort of general trends that we found unified a lot of the other hot topics, if you will, that we found in security and through the study. So for this one, Ivo, I want to take a shot at this one and just say, we've kind of, you'll see cloud adoption number 2 there, and you see Ivo and I dance carefully around this, because the reality is when we were building the study, we realized we can probably build a whole study just out of cloud security within itself, right? But we wanted to make sure that obviously this had more of a broad application, like we do focus on cloud elements, because the reality is about 89% of our customers today and of organizations in Canada finds themselves in some form of a hybrid IT approach, right? So there's just that you have to have that ability to look holistically at it. But the reality is, and Ivo sort of talked about security not playing catch up, but staying closely behind. One of the big things here is just the cybersecurity resource. And I think that's, it's old news. Everybody knows about this. It's a hot market. Everybody is struggling to find good talent. I do think there's fantastic talent out there. But the reality is, I think what's stretching our IT departments and our IT security departments specifically is things around like process transformation. So as we move to the cloud, I think a lot of companies tackle cloud in a way that we haven't seen before. And ironically, we actually see some companies repatriating data out of the cloud and bringing that back in-house again, right? So there's definitely this flux as people are trying to find the right balance in their organizations and services. But that process transformation obviously has a toll on IT and cybersecurity cycles. Cloud adoption, I think, those two sort of go hand in hand. We talked about those. Virtual business, just that whole thing of, we said, in the past, we would have remote workers, we'd have some people traveling, but suddenly the majority of your business finds itself in that state. The majority of your customers find themselves in that state. And then we look at how that drives things like remote work adoption. In the first half of 2020, the majority of the energy and effort we saw in the Canadian marketscape was, how do I get my remote users productive again? And then sort of in the same sentence, how do I do that securely? So how do I bring them into the environments and give them access back to data and services that traditionally was housed within the corporate environment? And that sort of became that the virtual boundary for security. And then Ivo sort of talked about APIs as well, right? But as everything went more virtual, so did our third party. So suddenly, we looked at integrations on the third party side, and we just saw a whole lot more of ecosystems starting to merge and work together. And we'll touch base on that a little bit as well. Eva, you want to chat about this one for us?
Sure, and I think we touched on it a little bit. Organizations have to think about cybersecurity innovation, and I think that lines up specifically with an overall digital transformation strategy that your organization has, right? And how your future security investments really need to be tied to your overall organizational plan and not be siloed. I think historically security has been either on purpose or just a natural organic growth within an organization, that the cybersecurity practice and everything that happens around it is very segmented from the rest of what's happening in the rest of the organization from a digital transformation perspective. And I think as we go through this, as we understand what's happening in the overall IT side of the house, it's important for cybersecurity to start adapting and becoming a little closer to that side of the house. So, I think it's a theme throughout here, and that growth within that we're going to talk about in terms of where people are going from a SaaS perspective, whatever we were able to grab on within the last year from a technology perspective, and what we were solving problems very quickly from a digital transformation, accelerating that. I think it's important that cybersecurity stays close to what's happening on the IT side. So. We want to go through the findings here, specifically what were the findings of the report, and we'll go through each finding. Some of them we were able to crunch some numbers and get a Western perspective on them, but it's the general findings are very interesting, and we'll go on to some recommendations at the end on what organizations can do. So. Zero trust is interesting, and Theo and I have had a ton of conversations on this as we went through the report, is really understanding, is zero trust past the buzzword? Is it past the buzzword stage? Is it a real enabler for today's business and technology? And the survey absolutely came back with that result, right? That we are past that stage where we're talking, this is not just a vendor-driven buzz, it's not just an organization buzz, but it is an architecture that is enabler for organizations, and they're able to expand beyond just a zero trust, as in, is it just network segmentation? No, it goes beyond that, right? And the growth, really that we've seen within the understanding of zero trust is in the identity side, growing things like, user provisioning, it's, scalability, and bringing in, identity and single sign-on as part of that overall zero trust architecture was a key for all businesses across Canada. So.
What was really interesting for me on Zero Trust is we had a really good conversation on a podcast with Cisco a while ago, and it dawned on us that Zero Trust is really something that as security professionals we've been doing for many, many years. We've always done it in a different format. So in its most original inception, it was this concept of how do I segment the network? Do you have the right IP? When you think about first firewalls, it was just, there was a trust element baked in. Did you make it into the building? Were you supposed to be in the building? Now, in hindsight, as technology has developed, those were very limited control sets. But even at that time, it was a way of differentiating who has access to what. And I think we're living in a very interesting time where that model is accelerated all the way up the OSI stack to where a lot of Zero Trust now is happening around that user, right? As we're adopting cloud, we'll talk about cloud in a little bit as well around this, the identity element of it. But it's really asking the who, what, where, why, and how question, like, right? Who's on that laptop? Is it a corporate device? How am I going to secure connectivity to the network? Should they have access? And do I have the controls to properly allow or restrict or monitor even the access that they have? And so when you think about it like that, although it's rooted in a security element of thinking, it's much wider. And just if you want to, having a quick look at the numbers here, this question here is really focused to try and ask our organizations, where do they see the benefit of having a Zero Trust model? And then, not surprisingly, improved monitoring and control enforcement for on-premise enterprise application was very high. I think that extends into cloud as well. The reality is that monitoring and control is for us comes from two things. It's one, having the correct checkpoints or control points to monitor traffic from. And then the other really big item is understanding who, from a user perspective, starting to access this information, right? And so suddenly we're seeing that. Improved agility was a big one too. What we found is as users or as organizations wrap their heads around identity and becoming more comfortable and leveraging things like extended Active Directory or extended authentic identity databases, right? Like that ability allowed them to turn up new SaaS services, new things that normally would ask a question around, how would you like to authenticate and authorize users to come in? Traditionally, for some organizations, that was a more difficult question. But I think as people are adopting the Zero Trust and thinking from identity and allowing only the needed access, they're forced to ask some of these questions that makes adoption of some of those services a lot easier. And then, those were sort of the two big items for me. And then again, simplified user provisioning led that for me into that fact that we're thinking about identity. How do we provision users? How do we assign identity? How do we make sure that our users have access to? And now I want to also preface this, like in CDW, we talk about fundamentals versus basics. A lot of these items sounds like basics on the surface, but when you add people and process, it's not basic anymore. Basic would imply easy. It's not easy to deploy in complex or even semi-complex environments. So we really like to term these as fundamentals. It's always great when we see the fundamentals being the benefiting from a new control. But by no means, when we're talking about this, we're not intending to imply this is easy, because it is not by any means.
No, it's interesting to see things like improve agility on a security, on an enabler, and having security be tied into enabling things as opposed to stopping things. So it's definitely, I think we're in the right direction. Not to be overly sunny and positive about the finding, but I think it's a good one. The next one is in terms of SOAR. So out of the organizations that we found that had deployed SOAR, we wanted to understand. How is SOAR showing the value that it needs to show? Is SOAR really producing the efficiency that is promised? And the answer was overwhelmingly yes. If you look at the lowest finding there, even aiding in compliance, it's 50%. 50% of respondents found value in using SOAR for that purpose, right? Obviously, centralizing data intelligence is an easy way to use SOAR, and it's where most organizations can do that, and bringing it all together, bringing more context to dashboards, streamlining ticketing. I think that there's a lot more value that can still be brought into security operations from a SOAR perspective, but the organizations that found that they deployed it and got it working within their environments found a lot of value out of SOAR. Every year there's a new technology or a new thing that we're digging into this year. Really, SOAR and AI ML are the two big areas that we dug into from a survey perspective, and this was a fairly positive finding from the SOAR side. Really increasing that security effectiveness. Not much on the response side yet, but I think as we continue to implement SOAR more and more, I think we're going to be able to use it more for that response side of the house as well.
Absolutely. And so, to Eva's point, one thing that I found very encouraging about this is when we look at the top 3 tasks, or even the top 4 tasks, those are the kind of tasks that puts a massive strain on your security operations teams or even your regular operations teams, right? And so for us, when we look at we already have a shortage of people and talent to deploy in the organization, or organizations are challenged to work with, perhaps in some cases, a limited resource set. Anytime I can take that resource and make them do things that humans are good at, keeps them engaged, keep them enticed, look for interesting things, start moving into, like, I don't want to quite call it threat hunting yet, but that ability to proactively start looking for things, as opposed to just doing the mundane, repetitive tasks over and over again, that is great for employee engagement. It's great for development of your resources. And it's just a fantastic way to make sure that your security goes from completely reactive to being, at the very least, more proactive. So while we definitely hope to see SOAR build into a proactive response, and we did have some respondents that indicated they were actually, disproportionately far along the response side, I think the reality is, if we can take the first win for SOAR being, take those mundane, repetitive tasks, take that off the hands of my analysts, leave them to do things that they're good at, but at the same time, reduce the chance of error in the mundane tasks because it's easily automated, that is a big win. The other element in talking to organizations, the other trend we see across the market too, is from a vendor perspective, it's very attractive to promise you the automation, because that's where the ROI for many organizations are embedded. But the orchestration piece is very important. And when you think about the prepare, defend, respond methodology, we have the orchestration piece really sits in that prepare. It's thinking through, making sure you have a process, making sure you have a consistent way of dealing and handling that alert. And once you have that mapped out, that's when we found the automation became really powerful, because then you can actually, where the elements are that make sense within your organization and your process flow to automate and take that lift off the human analyst.
For sure. And that ties into the next one quite a bit too, right, Theo? Where Absolutely. We're talking about AI and ML and how, again, digging in and asking, is AI ML living up to its promise within cybersecurity, and how is it being brought into security operations centers or security teams, and what are the top use cases that you would use from a AI ML within the environment? So, continue on the same topic, really. They've, data center network detection, right at the top. Cybersecurity operations follow closely. So, we're really seeing, 80% of the people surveyed have deployed at least one AI ML for cybersecurity cases, right? Highly, and what we found as well is that these AI ML are really tied to vendors at this point. Internal data scientists are not yet working as much as they are in other areas of the business, specifically on the cybersecurity side. So we have to lean on our vendor community to help with AI ML within cybersecurity. So, any more context you want to add here, Theo, from what we found from an AI ML perspective?
Right. No, I think that's this is why this table is in here. We did ask respondents on whether it was more tools-based approach or whether it was actual doing their own analytics and building their own ML. Needless to say, you need a data science team to really do that. And I think when you look at the average Canadian organization, that is not a common skill set that's available to them or even affordable potentially. So that's definitely one of the big items that we looked at here. And after we realized the majority answers slanted towards the vendor side, we then had a look at the breakdown here and the use cases specifically contrasted against that. And you'll see things, again, like the data center network threat detection, cyber operational efficiencies, reducing the alerts and alert fatigue. Again, it's all improving your analyst's life. It's helping your people being more efficient and more effective. And I think the big thing here for me too then is just that it is still tools based, and we're excited. We're monitoring closely to see where, as we look at EDR and MDR and some of these other like having a managed detection and response, we're seeing more and more of our actual SIM platforms and data and log collector platforms embedding AI and ML interfaces, and we're very cautious, like excitedly monitoring to see how we can start seeing some benefit. Because on the flip side, you'll hear everywhere and we see everywhere that the bad actors are definitely not holding back. They're looking at AI and ML, how now they can leverage it. So it's something that needs our attention and focus for sure.
Yeah, and when we looked at Western Canada, there wasn't a lot of difference in terms of the data. One of the things that we did notice is that cloud threat detection, it's still number one was still the data center network threat detection use cases where AI ML was being used, but we noticed also that cloud threat detection also went up the list here to number 2. So we attribute this obviously to just because this is so vendor driven, the likelihood of Western Canada being different than the country is probably because of different vendor focuses within certain businesses in Western Canada, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, oil patch, and BC as well, having a different vendor approach and a different tool set that's being offered out there.
The other interesting stat we saw as well is that across small and medium organizations, there seems to be a more even distribution in the adoption of, like, at least at the application where we saw users responding. And again, we believe that it's just the type of tool sets, the type of rollouts that's occurring here. People are actually really looking and driving to see how do they leverage this to make their lives and the lives of their analysts even better.
Just hopefully it's not a curveball for you, Theo, but thinking about, a small business and adopting of AI ML, obviously going through a vendor option is the simplest, easiest method to get there, right? Building your own internal security,
right.
your own internal, AI ML team takes more than trying to do that from the security side. What do you think is the right approach for, small, medium business, especially, for our audience in Western Canada, if they want to start using AI ML tools, but don't have
right. So it's a great question. I'm actually going to tie it. So we're starting to get questions on the Q&A, and some of these we're going to park for the end. We have a little bit of time allotted at the end. But there's actually a question that ties very nicely to that, Eva, where it's, anonymous attendee is asking if AI ML can we give examples of what type of vendor or tool would have an offering for AI ML? And I think that ties into some of the consumption. So the interesting thing with this question is I think there's already ML baked into a lot of tool sets that people don't necessarily consider an ML-based tool set. In its earliest inception, we had organizations such as BlackBerry and the endpoint client really jump on this to get the efficacy and the accuracy of their antivirus and endpoint protection platforms up. And so we really saw that build of modeling around behavior for applications and users. So I think, when we look at that, I still think one of the fastest low-hanging fruits for AI ML that you're going to see, and it's really embedded in there, is that whole efficacy and accuracy on endpoints. We're starting to see it catch threats and alerts that would have been very, very difficult to near impossible with pure signature-based engines, right? So when you look at your endpoint security, that's definitely strong. Where we're starting to see a number of it as well is if and when you tackle your identity access management, and this is one that's very sensitive and you have to approach it carefully, but is around the user behavioral analysis. There's a fine line between potentially being too intrusive, and it really varies by organization and by sector and vertical, and how it's mandated and how organizations work with it. But the reality is there's a lot to be said for that, tying together some of that user behavioral patterns that we used to try and do on SIM. We used to try and come up with, if Evo connected from Winnipeg and suddenly from an overseas country at the same time within 20 minutes, is that realistic, right? And so a lot of times we were reactive in that we'd see this threat, we'd go and write a use case to try and address it. And then you'd hope for finding a provider out there that has the most possible use cases, hoping that you have the best chance of hitting all these scenarios, right? And so a lot of times when we see RFPs come out for SIM, one of the early questions was, how many use cases have you developed and what's unique to your use cases, right? The reality for those questions is like, how are you going to make sure you catch stuff that other people wouldn't? And when we're starting to see a real strength in this behavioral analysis based on the ML and the modeling, is then being able to say, like, what does, how should a user in my HR organization specifically behave? And when they deviate from that, flag that for me so that my analyst can actually go have a look at that, right? And so I'd say when you start looking at like examples of those, the AI ML, it's really around anything that has to do with data collection and that initial response. So endpoint, SIM we're seeing a lot. And then the other area where we're starting to see a lot of organizations try to apply that AI ML level as well is configuration assessment and monitoring against policies. So we're seeing more and more products and vendors out in the market that's doing things like monitoring your cloud policy and configuration to make sure that it stays aligned with the business, but also to look for deviations outside of that. So I hope that helps a little bit. For the first question, please post a follow-up if there's more on that one. In the meantime, feel free to add questions there. We're going to address them in a few minutes when we get to the end there. Okay, Ivo, I'm going to
absolutely. Let's
slide along here just for a time check for us.
This question, I think, when we were discussing earlier, I think, talking about, this multi-layer security approach for cloud consumption, there's a serious growth in the market from SaaS to, from on-prem to IaaS to PaaS and SaaS, and it's changing how Canadian organizations are, what the posture of Canadian organizations it really is from a security perspective, as they shift more and more the responsibility to their cloud providers, right? So Theo, can you describe a little bit what we mean by multi-layer security approach, and
Sure.
what these findings really mean for us?
Absolutely. So when we looked at this is really what we also refer to as defense in depth, right? And it's just that ability to look at different layers at different places. And it's interesting because it tied in with the SaaS. And I think the reality is software as a service, when you look at a shared responsibility model, the reality is in many cases, many of the security controls that support that service is coming from a cloud provider or service provider that is their bread and butter, and their livelihood rely on securing that application to that layer. So they're going to do a great job of layering in multiple security layers. When we start then looking at this, and this is where zero trust and where we talked about why this is sort of an overarching concept, but when you tie zero trust back into this again, now we're starting to look at how am I authenticating my users? Am I securing the endpoint? Am I allowing devices, is it a BYOD? Is it a corporately issued device? Once it gets in, is it supposed to access something? Those are the kind of questions that drive this multi-layer security defense. And so when organizations, especially smaller organizations, we saw a huge shift as they adopted more SaaS, we actually saw their attack levels come down significantly. You can see they're down to the tune from 50.7 to 43. We saw that actual incident, the attack level went up, but the incident level came down. So obviously you're in the cloud, it's more public, people are more concerned, you're watching more closely. But we actually saw as those controls layered in, organizations are actually doing better against attacks. And we'll touch very quickly, there's another finding, but I'll touch it now while we're here. We talked about third party and vendor. Access is obviously a hot topic right now based on the last 6 months. But when we look at the organizations that successfully stopped or very early on caught or detected those, that was through multi-layer security as well. It was that ability to check at the gateway, why is my device that normally only connects home for updates suddenly connecting to these new IPs? And again, that becomes that combination of a log-based system that can look for trends and patterns combined with the right tools and checkpoints so that we can ask the right questions of our data.
So from a concept perspective, Theo, defense in depth is the old way we talked about. Zero trust is the new way, right? Are those competing? Do you think those are competing philosophies, or do you think they work together?
No, I actually think they work together. I think we're asking questions differently. At least it's forcing us to ask questions a little bit more widely. I think traditionally, defense in depth, if you thought about that defend middle box is where people said, well, I'm putting a firewall in and I have an endpoint and I'm doing this and I'm doing this, right? And that worked. That was layered defense. But I think, then SIM came around to try and coordinate all the information from this, because we realized just having the layers didn't mean anything if we weren't correlating the data and coordinating it properly. And I think the great thing with zero trust is we're asking the questions at a higher level. So now you're starting to ask the who, what, when, and where, as opposed to just like, how do I physically secure, or what's that technical control? So I think they are actually complementary. Like with all things, we advise, don't shoehorn your business into the model. Take the governance model, take the security concept, understand the reasoning behind it, and make sure you adapt it into your business so that your business actually operates in alignment with it, as opposed to being a time and point where you hit that stat.
That's absolutely right. And that's something we haven't touched a lot on, which is the risk-based approach for building your security program, right? Whereas these concepts are great from a technical or an architect or our level of conversation. It's important to make sure that these things are justified within the business so you can carry them through. Finding number 5 is a negative finding. We found that not enough organizations are conducting testing internally or externally or through third party. We found, planned penetration testing, like whether part of a risk management strategy or a compliance strategy, is conducted only by 58.3% of respondents. So it's very low overall, and 66 and 63 of smaller, medium, large organizations, are respectively doing penetration testing or internal testing on a regular basis. So penetration testing has been part of our frameworks for a long time. It's been part of a requirement for PCI, part of the NIST framework. It's always been really, really pushed on organizations, and yet we're not conducting them on a regular basis. Theo, any thoughts on why there's still this hesitation to do penetration testing within certain business areas?
Just fundamentals versus basics. People know they should. It makes sense they do. It's not always easy. Again, like with the rate of change organizations have experienced and where data as a service is moving, this should be more important than ever in that prepare phase and understanding on an ongoing basis. But we acknowledge it's not always easy. But here's one tactical item that we can give a sneak peek at recommendations, and that is, whether it's a third party or whether it's internal, like you have your own team, pen testing is important. Understand what that attack surface on the new environment looks like and understand so continuously. It's critical. That's really important.
Yeah, and we'll definitely touch on it more when we get to the recommendations, and I hope we get to them, right, as we're running.
Yeah, we're gonna pick up the pace a tad, but here just to stay on track. This one here, I think I'm hoping we're gonna get questions in the final section on third-party risks. But even if you don't, we talked about this briefly. As we've pushed our environments into the cloud, it's more virtual access, more so than ever before. We're relying on more parties. The numbers of the statistics, we saw numbers on upwards of 11, 20, and up to 100 third-party suppliers in the respondents and above. So when you think about that, you need a tactic, you need a strategy to deal with that. You have to think that through. It comes back to that prepare, defend, respond. Run yourself through that model. When you adopt that new supply chain or that third party, marry it with zero trust. Like, should they have access to this? Can I monitor it? Am I doing this properly? Is there layers of defense in place that help prevent or monitor and detect? The reality is, you'll see the stats here, but 4 in 5 organizations experience some form of cybersecurity breach. This is not shocking. We've talked about this year after year. We've seen this attack type go back as far as we can remember. So just again, this is where this is a people process problem, not a technology. The technology will support it, but this really is where when we start looking at people and process and having that security plan and having that incident response plan in place, this is just critical around this. This is the other very tactical takeaway that you can take from the study, if nothing else, although I'm sure based on the past 6 months, most people are already quite aggressively evaluating this by themselves.
I like to call this the I told you so finding. Right.
Yes.
We're talking about it 5 years in a row, and now now we're in the news with this one, right? And I think as an organization, all security practitioners, we've been talking about third-party supply chain potential issues and yet, yeah, here we are, right? So let's see if there's something we can do there from a findings perspective. This 7, from a recommendations perspective, I mean, you know, this last finding, it's very specific to actually the question that was asked. You know what? Every year we ask, do you need more people? Do you need, do we have a skill shortage in cybersecurity? And the answer is an overwhelming yes. I would like more. You know, there's lots of jobs and there's lots of opportunity, but in this year we actually went a little deeper and said, where are those gaps? Where are you finding the biggest gaps within when you're hiring cybersecurity people within this industry? And you know, the majority of it was in the governance, risk, and compliance side of the house, where it's very, very difficult to break in, but it's also very difficult to find capable people that can help you on that side. So GRC was overwhelming. And second, in second place was vendor-specific knowledge. So having people who know how to manage a specific technology, be it, you know, from the top firewall vendors, or be it from a SIM perspective. It's, you know, and that, you know, it really is a finding that, you know, if you're out in the market, focus, those are 2 areas you could focus. And I see it ties into the question that was asked, which is what pathway should a computer science student chase when it comes to cybersecurity? My recommendation every time somebody asks me that question is, go to where your curiosity is. You're going to be more interested. You're going to be more engaged. You're going to have a much more of a fun time in cybersecurity if you focus specifically on what your curiosity is within the space. AI ML is a growing space. If you're interested in that side of the house, go for it. If you like, you know, if you like the governance side of the house, focus on that direction. There's plenty of it here, you know, but you know, it's always that chicken and egg problem, right? How do I get experience if I don't have experience? So there are there's entry level areas through all these conversations. So, you know, focusing specifically on where your curiosity is, and digging into those areas is what I recommend.
So Ivo, I'm gonna here at this stage, I'm gonna quickly grab this one here. The reality is this is a slide. I'm gonna back up. This is a slide every study needs. If you want to be serious, we have to do a cost calculation. IDC does this for us. It's complex. It's crazy. Unfortunately, to no surprise here, the cost of attacks have gone up. The cost to remediate has gone up. I'm not gonna, based on time, I really want to dig into the findings. The reality is this is broken down into the security study. So go to cdw.ca/security study. The link's also at the end of the presentation. You can download that. They will break this down and show you the variables so you can sort of customize it based on your own organization. This is the slide I wanted to touch base on. We've done this a little bit. Some of this seems straightforward. Again, I'm going to highlight basics versus fundamentals, but evaluate your current technology stack and processes. Do that, prepare. Is it working for the way my business has evolved? Is it working for based on what we need to do? And is it aligned with architectures and different programs that we're looking to adopt, right? And this is where you can work with your, internal with your teams. You can work with your preferred third-party security partner, bring them in, let them have this conversation with you. Do those pen tests, do risk assessments, plan for resilience, do that IR so that you're building the right stack and solutions for your people to respond to. The next really big one for us is introducing automation and machine learning into your SOC sooner rather than later. So start doing that, right? There's no easy answer. We talked about the different tool sets. Shift that DevOps. So we had the question from the CS student there. The reality is, you can go into the traditional architecture and technology controls, but we're seeing more and more importance on having a DevOps mindset. So when you're introducing automation and orchestration, your SOC and your ops team should almost have this approach of like, if it made it past the automation tool, what went wrong? What can I go back and automate? Why was this different? And with that approach, what you're doing is you reduce or you increase your events per analyst hour. This is what we talk about, that metric. So how many events can an analyst handle? And what you want to do, you want to increase that because that means you're reducing your mundane workload on your actual analysts. Maximize security benefits. Again, I think this is pretty straightforward, but it's a fundamental, not basic, but have a look at what third-party tools can bring to you. Or look when it's on-prem, have a discussion around the selection of tools, but make sure you get that into these environments and you're building a layered approach. Formalize the vulnerability management program. This is just that direct hit from this. Do this regularly, scan, make sure you're patching, and make sure you're doing pen testing, you understand that attack surface. And then we talked about review third-party ecosystem regularly and run that through that zero trust and the prepare, defend, respond, and just think, am I doing this the way I should do this? So Eva, any thoughts? Like, I didn't see any other questions come in, but any other thoughts? Because I think we are right at time.
I think we could spend hours and hours talking about this. And luckily, you know, people can download the study. I put the link in the chat as well. And if you can go to the last slide, we also have an event where we go through with IDC specifically.
Awesome.
You don't. Yeah, and we're going to go through all the details of this study together with, you know, and look at the methodology and all those pieces.
And with that, we are at time. Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate it. Feel free to reach out and have a wonderful day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. All right.